Hey everybody, welcome to episode 5 of Improv Ideas. Today we are going to be doing a continuation on what we have been discussing in the previous 2 episodes talking about bebop scales. So far we have covered 2 of the 3 main bebop scales that people are typically taught, although there are many more beyond 3. But so far we did the major and the Dorian bebop scale, which give you some new ideas to experiment with over major 7 and minor 7 chords. And now to tie all 3 together, we are going to be going over the dominant bebop scale, which gives you some additional chromaticism that you can experiment with over dominant 7 chords. So to start out, let's talk about what a dominant 7 bebop scale is derivative from. So all a dominant bebop scale is a mixolydian mode with 1 chromatic note added to it. So let's go over first what is happening intervallically in a mixolydian mode, and then I'll show you where the chromaticism is added to make it the dominant bebop scale. So I'm going to do everything in the key of G. So a G mixolydian mode intervallically would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7, and then 8. So it's just a major scale, but you take the 7 and you lower it a half step to give it the flatted 7, so it works over a dominant 7 chord. Now to make it a dominant bebop scale, all we have to do is add a chromatic note in between the flatted 7th and the 8th. So when we get to the last note of the scale, the F note, rather than going back up to the G, we're going to do F, F sharp, and G. So now, intervallically, the dominant bebop scale would be this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, flat 7, major 7, and then 8, or root. Right, if I go up the second octave. Okay, and you might be a little confused at first and wondering to yourself, how does a major 7th interval work over a dominant 7 chord? But you'd be amazed at how many different ways that you can make these notes work and just, use some chromaticism to get from point A to point B. And basically what I would say when you're experimenting with this scale is, as long as you don't have a line where you're like hanging on the F sharp for an extended period of time or landing your line on an F sharp note, you could pretty much get away with most stuff in terms of, mixing around these intervals. Just, you don't want to make that one, odd note out like the centerpiece of the line. You want it to be some sort of passing note, similar to how we were utilizing the Dorian bebop scale in the previous episode, right? Because we added a major third, but we were playing it over a minor chord. So you don't want to hang on that major third, right? You want to resolve it to a note either above or below, similar to what I just said with the dominant as well. So to start out, I'm going to run up and down the 7 different scale fingerings for the G dominant bebop scale all throughout the neck, and then I'll talk about a couple of different cool sounding arpeggios that I like that line up within this scale. And as always, if you would like scale fingerings as well as all of the arpeggios that I go over and 5 licks within this scale, you can head over to patreon.com/MikeGaudetteMusic. So we already went through the first fingering, but I'll do it again starting on G. So now as I run through these additional fingerings, all I'm doing is I'm running through my mode fingerings, and I just have to find the chromaticism that's happening between the F and the G. So I'm running my fingerings, and anytime I see an F note, I just add an additional chromatic going between the F and the G. Okay, now the second fingering starts on A, and it will sound like this. Okay, third fingering will start on B. It sounds like this. Okay, fourth fingering will start on C. I'm in the same position, but now I just start on the C note with my middle finger instead. So now we have this. Now for our fifth fingering, we start on D and we get this. Okay, sixth fingering starts on E and it sounds like this. And then our final fingering, fingering number 7, we're going to stay in the same position, but instead of starting on E, we start on F with our middle finger, which gives us this. Okay, so with all of these scales that we do, I always recommend getting as comfortable as you can, being able to do the fingerings and being able to visualize the scale in as many spots on the neck as you can. But that can be a lot starting out, so I always tell people, you know, if it's too much to do all of this at once, just take one position and just try to really dissect it and get as comfortable as you can, being able to visualize the intervals, visualize some of the arpeggios that line up within the fingering, and then when you feel like you're ready, you know, expand to some different spots on the neck. So those are the scale fingerings. Now I'm going to talk about a couple of cool sounding arpeggios that line up within this scale. So because we have the flatted 7th and the major 7th together, we can build some arpeggios around those two notes. So these are going to be a couple that are a little bit more bizarre and outside of the ordinary, similar to the arpeggios that we talked about in the previous 2 episodes. So one that I discovered that I really liked the sound of was a D minor arpeggio with the major 3rd. So it has the F and the F sharp, right? So you can either call it D minor add major 3 or D major sharp 9. I don't really know the proper name for it, whatever, you know, makes the most sense to you. But that arpeggio, if we do the full range down in this position, we would start on F sharp and we would get this. Okay, so like I said, it's a D minor with the major 3rd as well. So going back to what I said earlier about the major 7th interval and how we can use it over a dominant 7 chord, I was saying that it's an interval that you don't want to land a line on, or you don't want to hang on the major 7th for too long. And that's something to always be mindful of. And if I'm using this arpeggio, I do need to be aware of that as I'm playing it, because the F sharp is a big part of this arpeggio. So for example, if I was doing a line like this, right, sounds totally fine against G7 because I'm landing on the F natural. But if I went, I'm not going to want to land on the F sharp because that's going to clash with the dominant 7 chord. But if I go, right, it sounds totally fine. It just passes right by. It lands on a nice stable note. It's not really going to clash with the ears. So, you know, all of these arpeggios, all of these scale fingerings, everything that you're doing within this, just always be mindful of that F sharp note and how you're going to maneuver around it. And before I get into the improv section of this video, I'll talk about some different ways that you can maneuver around these chromatics. So that was one of the arpeggios. We could also do that up in this position as well, the D minor with the major 3rd. So up here it would be. Okay, so it gives us some cool sounds to experiment with, right? Because if we look at this arpeggio against G7, this is the 5, the flat 7, the major 7, and then the 9, right? So we get a couple of chord tones, we get the chromatic note, and we get a color tone, which is the 9. Okay, now another arpeggio that can line up in this scale that is combining the flatted 7th and major 7th interval together is actually an F major arpeggio with the flatted 9 added to it. So if we look at just the F major arpeggio and how it relates to G, it's the flatted 7th, the 9, and then the 11, right? So we actually have 2 color tones with this one. But now if we add the F sharp to that, right, to get the flatted 7th and the major 7, it becomes an F major with a flat 9. So if we do that through this position, it sounds like this. Okay, and then another spot we can do that arpeggio is starting up on the 8th fret of the A string. So that one would sound like this. Okay, so whenever I try to come up with arpeggios for some of these scales, I always try to see if I can find some unique ways of combining the chromatic notes that make it, you know, that bebop-y sort of sound, because, you know, the bebop scales can be utilized just for some straight chromatic playing, you know, or you can kind of combine the chromatic notes into some of these more, outside of the box sounding arpeggios. And I always find that that's a really fun way to try to get some new sounds out of these scales. So those are some of the arpeggios that I like. So before I go into a demonstration of, playing around this scale and these arpeggios, let's just talk a little bit about a couple of different ways that we can utilize some of these chromatic sounds. So like I said, we'll stick to right here, this position, these three notes. So the most basic one that people would do is you just go chromatically from the root note down to the flatted seventh. Right? You probably hear that all the time. Right? That's a really commonly played lick. Another thing that people will do sometimes is you play a major arpeggio descending, starting on the fifth. So you go, and then when you get down to the root note, you just go down 2 chromatics. Right? That's a really cool sound. And that's a pretty easy thing to do, especially if you are already comfortable with your major arpeggios. Just find all of your G major arpeggios throughout the neck, and anytime you see the root note, just know that you can go down 2 half steps when you hit the root. Okay, now there are other notes that we can also start on to build some of these chromatics rather than just starting on the root note. You can start on the major 7 and you can do this. Major 7, root, flat 7, right? So I start on that chromatic note, then I go up to the root, and then I land on the flatted 7th. So pretty much as long as you're landing on a strong note, you can really get away with a lot of stuff. Right? Right, you can do that. Flat 7, major 7, flat 7. Nothing wrong with that. Okay, now another really cool thing about this scale is if we look at the 3 chromatics that we have up at the top, the flat 7, the major 7, and then the root, we can actually also add the 6 because the 6 is a half step below the flatted 7th. Now once we do that, we actually have 4 different chromatics. And when you start mixing those together, you can get a really bebop-y sound. So one of the most common examples of that would be this. So I'm going 6, root, major 7, 6, flat 7. Right? So a very common sound. Right? We hear that all the time in bebop. So in addition to just having these 3 notes to kind of maneuver around, we can also add that 6, and that gives us an additional chromatic. And anytime we have an additional chromatic note, it opens up so many more possibilities of different ways to maneuver around these scales. So that's a little bit about how you can maneuver around some of these chromatics, and we talked about the scale fingerings and the arpeggios. Now I'm going to do a little demonstration just over a G dominant 7 vamp so you can hear what some of these ideas sound like put into practice. Okay, so I'm just going to improvise for a bit, and I will try to utilize all of the different chromatic approaches that we had discussed, and I will throw in some of those arpeggios as well so you could hear what they sound like against a G7 chord. So here we go. So right here I'm doing flatted 7th up to major 7th back down, right? And notice if I hang on the major 7, right, it clashes, but as soon as I move it back down, it sounds fine, right? Right there, I did the D minor with the major 3rd arpeggio. Right, much more of an outside sound compared to playing, more chromatically and scalier. So, use it accordingly depending on what kind of sound you're going for. Now I'll do the F major with the flat 9. Right? Once again, a little bit more outside, so use accordingly. Okay, so as you can see, the addition of that one note opens up a whole new world of sounds that we can start implementing in our improvisation, between the chromaticism that we can achieve, as well as some more of these slightly more outside sounds, utilizing some of these arpeggios that combine those chromatic notes together. So just an all-around really great scale, and very helpful for getting more into, bebop improvisation, hence the name, obviously. So that was our episode for this week. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something and have some new sounds to start implementing into your playing. And like I said, if you would like PDFs of all of the scale fingerings and the arpeggios that I went over today, as well as 5 licks within this scale, you can head over to patreon.com/MikeOdetteMusic. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you at the next episode. Take care.